Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Sheena Chestnut Greitens, Editor-in-Chief of TNSR, and I'm here with Dr. Ryan Best, our Executive Editor. We're pleased to have joining us today national security expert Herb Lin, author of Artificial Intelligence and Nuclear Weapons, a Commonsense Approach to Understanding Costs and Benefits. That article appeared in Volume 8, Issue 3 of the Texas National Security Review. Herb is a senior research scholar and research fellow at Stanford University with interests at the intersection of national security and emerging technology. He's also the director of the Stanford Emerging Technology Review. Herb, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. It's great to have you on the show.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Herb, this article comes at a moment of growing concern about AI and national security and renewed global anxiety about nuclear use. You begin the article by noting that the skepticism in much of the commentary on the application of AI to the nuclear enterprise isn't really the whole picture. I just wanted to ask or start us off talking about what was your goal in writing this piece and how are you trying to reframe the conversation?
Well, okay, so mostly the debate over nuclear weapons and by extension applying AI to nuclear weapons focuses on the following idea. Hey, here's a great idea. Let's give ChatGPT the launch codes. I've been looking at you on video. Both of you are smiling about that. You both think that's a ridiculous idea. Well, fortunately, most of the military, in fact, all of the military thinks that's a stupid idea, right? In fact, there's nobody that's seriously thinking about doing that. Nobody. So to the extent that the debate focuses on that question, it's a non-issue. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody is saying that that's a good thing to do. And that's where the center of gravity of the attention of AI and nuclear weapons is directed. So let me give you another different idea. You're typing up a memo for somebody on the nuclear targeting staff. So you're clearly working on a command and control function, nuclear command and control. And you use Microsoft Word to do it. And then you do a spell check on it. And you run spell check. You have now used AI to perform a nuclear command and control function. Nobody's going to argue with you about that. That's an entirely uncontroversial use of AI. No person in their right mind would object to it. It's clearly a benign application of AI, nuclear command and control. So between the stuff that's clearly ridiculously stupid, where don't ever do AI there, and where it's completely uncontroversial, doing spell check, which is an AI, there's a lot of stuff in between. And the intellectual task is to understand what is there in between those two different kinds of AI application and see whether or not in any given instance does applying AI make any sense. Furthermore, one of the things that the article points out is that there are even instances in which AI can help enhance human control of the nuclear weapons. It's not just a bad thing or benign and harmless. Sometimes it actually helps to maintain human control. So there's a whole range of applications that should be relatively uncontroversial, and I want to focus attention on them too.
So I think I'm beginning to understand why you subtitled the article A Commonsense Approach to Understanding Risks and Benefits. I wanted to sort of follow up a little bit on this idea of a common sense approach and ask you to elaborate on what misunderstandings about AI you think in the current conversation are most dangerous or most misleading as it relates to this area of thinking about AI and nuclear weapons.
Well, a lot of people who think about AI at the lay level, they think about Terminator and Skynet and so on as this thing that will just run amok, out of control. And is it possible to design an AI system to do that? Sure. But as the late Dick Irwin once said, we could be that stupid, but we don't have to be. There's no requirement to do dumb things. And are there ways in which AI could pose catastrophic risk of nuclear weapons? You bet there are. No question about it. But let's not do those things. And there is a sense in which it really is as simple as that. The question is, how do you want to be thinking about AI in nuclear weapons? And where can it help enhance the mission? And where shouldn't it? And where shouldn't you be using it? The article also makes what I think is an interesting point, that even if AI doesn't touch nuclear weapons at all, ever, nuclear risk can still be affected by the use of AI in other domains. So if you use, for example, AI in ballistic missile defense, or in anti-satellite warfare, or in conventional warfare, the consequences of bad decisions or even good decisions in AI there might have implications for you in whether or not you use nuclear forces, which is why I say that it's important to consider AI in the broad context, not just as applied to nuclear weapons. So AI risk can come from many different places, and benefits can come from many different places too. And my job in the article was to try to unpack some of that, to make the debate a more nuanced and therefore a more relevant debate.
Early in the piece, you emphasize that the risks and benefits of using AI can't be separated from a country's broader nuclear posture. From a framing perspective for policymakers, can you unpack a little bit more what that means and how understanding nuclear posture helps us grasp the full scope of where AI might actually enter the nuclear enterprise?
Sure. So, for example, forget about AI for the moment. Listeners know that the U.S. depends on a triad of nuclear forces. One of those forces in the U.S. is the silo-based ICBMs. And as you know, the U.S. has always retained the option of doing a launch on warning as a way of protecting the ICBM so that an adversary could not launch a first strike on them with confidence that we would not be able to launch them. It's not a part of doctrine, but it's part of doctrine to have that option. So, of course, we all know that this introduces the risk of a false launch. That is, if your warning turns out to be wrong, you might launch your ICBMs towards the other guy, and there was no attack. Instead of responding to an attack, now you started World War III. This is a bad deal for everybody. So that's the concern about launch on warning. Now, people say, well, if you put AI in charge, now you're going to introduce more possible mistakes. And so maybe an AI system will do a launch on warning, will be more likely to do a launch on warning, or advise the president, or even push the button themselves and say, nobody wants to do that, but it'll tell the president, you have to launch now. That's sort of the extreme version of the concern. It's not an unreasonable concern, but that's taking U.S. nuclear posture as a fixed constraint. It doesn't have to be a fixed constraint. There are many people who advocate getting rid of the ICBMs, respectable people. I don't want to take sides on that debate, but let's say you decided that we don't need the land-based leg anyway very much, and let's go to a dyad, bombers and SLBMs. Let's assume we did that. In this situation, there's clearly no risk of a launch on warning. You don't need to launch the ICBMs to prevent them from being destroyed because there are no ICBMs. So if I put in AI now and give it some advisory capacity to advise under the circumstances of a warning of attack, which we would still have, the risks are completely different now. It can't launch ICBMs on warning because there are no ICBMs. And clearly the risk of AI going rogue in that situation, doing the wrong thing in that situation, much less than the situation in which you do have ICBMs. Anybody would agree with that. So the point is that you can adjust for some of the risk. You can change the risk profile entirely by adjusting your posture. That was the point, that it's not a decision that's separate from other matters.
So let me go into the meat of the article a little bit. And at one point before you start applying the framework that we've started to discuss here, you actually lay out 5 points that you think are really important for people to understand machine learning. And I wondered if before we move into more discussion of the application, if you could just walk us through what are those 5 points and why it's important for people to understand those parts of machine learning when we're thinking about AI.
First is that humans remain the most essential element of nuclear command and control. I hope I don't have to defend that point. That's a softball, right? That you want humans involved in this. It's not entirely irrational to say, well, there's some humans I don't really want to be in charge of nuclear weapons. There's at least a part of the debate over sole authority that gets into that. The second was we just this question about thinking about AI in the context of a nation's nuclear posture. So that includes the doctrine and the force structure and so on. Do you have ICBMs or not? That clearly changes the risks and benefits. I made the comment that said that international agreements to limit the use of AI in the nuclear weapons context are unlikely to be achieved. Now, the reason I say that is I'm not happy about it, but essentially AI is software, and there's no way you can verify software. There's no way that we will know whether or not the other guy is running an AI model on their system. And besides, what counts as AI anyway? So I think that the verification issues, the definitional issues, the trust issues there, I think are all daunting. I think you'll never come to any agreement on that point. Number 4 is the idea that you can, in fact, mitigate risks from AI by judiciously choosing your own AI uses. We don't have to do dumb things. Don't do dumb things with AI. And then we can get into an argument about what's dumb and what's not.
Let me ask a couple of follow-up questions about that. So one of the things that I was really struck by in your piece is that you argue that current national commitments to keep humans in control don't go far enough. And so I was thinking about the agreement, which is a sentence or two that was announced between the United States and China, and some of the other discussions that I've seen in international fora about this. So what for you would it take for human control to be meaningful? And so where are the biggest gaps that current policies should try to close?
Well, my complaint was at an earlier level, which is that to say humans are in control, I can imagine ways in which that is a formally true statement and yet is pretty meaningless. The example that I have is that, well, here's something that the agreement says we're not going to do. We're not going to give ChatGPT the launch codes. Fine. But let's say you have the president there, or your decision maker, the person at the top of the apex of the nuclear command and control system. And the president has to issue the order to launch. But let's say that president is only surrounded by machines that give the president input, and that all of those machines are AI machines. They're all AI driven. There's no human in any of them. I don't know about you, but that doesn't make me feel a whole lot more confident. That's basically equivalent. I think you would agree that that's almost, not quite, but that kind of circumvention of the spirit of the humans in control. That doesn't make you feel better, right? That's still a bad thing. Although technically humans are still in control. The reason that I want to use a phrase like meaningful or appropriate human control is that as soon as you hear those words, you say, well, what's meaningful? What does that mean? It stimulates an argument. Now get into an argument about it. And that argument is a good argument to have. You think it means that you have to have 3 real human beings and so on, and they have to be next to the president physically. We'll get into an argument, get into a discussion about that. And that discussion is really meaningful. That's where wisdom will come out of. But if you formally satisfy a requirement, like humans have to be in the loop, I'm not enthusiastic about that precisely because it can be circumvented so easily. So that's why I think that humans in the loop doesn't go far enough.
So throughout this piece, you talk a lot about human involvement in this spectrum that humans should be, or that AI should be involved in this enterprise, some of which are critical, some of which are mundane. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more or dig a little bit deeper into the benefits versus the risks of this concept. What are some of the cases where AI integration might be beneficial enough to outweigh any risks that we might incur?
I have a set of criteria in which I say that a deployment of AI in a nuclear context is less risky if one or more of the following conditions are true. And the first one in that is the stakes of application are low and the consequences of a mistake are minimal. An example of that could be predictive maintenance. Predictive maintenance is an AI-based technique to predict when a part is about to fail. And you don't wait until it fails. You replace it just before it fails. And so the system doesn't go down unexpectedly and so on. Let's say your predictive maintenance algorithm is wrong. So it predicts a failure too early. Then what you've done is you've wasted money on a premature replacement. Or let's say it fails to anticipate it. That means you have to replace the part when it fails. You have to have unscheduled maintenance. Well, we have that now. So the stakes, they're not very large. It's sort of a little bit of maybe extra expense and so on. It's not a big deal. I'm all for predictive maintenance. Now, the other criteria, I think, it starts to get more interesting. For example, I suggest that if the application in question that you're considering is being pursued in the commercial world. Now, the commercial world has a lot of advantages to it. Among other things, the commercial world has a profit motive, and it doesn't do things that don't make sense from a commercial point of view, whereas the military doesn't have that kind of metric. If the commercial world is doing it, maybe there are insights that you can derive from them that you wouldn't have just doing it for yourself. Here's an example. Anything AI related to the KC-46 tanker is probably a reasonable thing to think about, especially in terms of maintenance and so on. The tanker is one that's going to be used for strategic refueling, strategic mission refueling, and so on. Why am I focusing on the KC-46 tanker? Because it's the militarized version of the Boeing 767. And Boeing is doing a lot of AI stuff on the 767 for maintenance, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. So the lessons that Boeing has learned on the 767 and providing AI functionality in various parts of that, well, there's some chance that might be relevant to the KC-46. That's a good thing. And you minimize the risk. By contrast, there's nobody in the private sector that's developing an AI application that will develop different courses of action after nuclear war is started. Nobody in the private sector is doing that. There's no commercial value in that. That would mean that the second application about developing different courses of action, that's a higher risk. The third thing that I talk about on my list is whether or not the application affords humans time to review the output. You want to be able to check the work. And even if you don't actually check the work, you want to have the option of checking the work. So, for example, if I do AI for route planning, then you want to optimize it with respect to fuel consumption or avoidance of air defenses or something like that. It provides a proposed route, and I can look at the route and I can say, does it really do a good job? So that's good. That's pre-planned. It gives me some time to do that. Of course, if you have to do this in real time, maybe that's a little bit dicier, but I don't have time to do it. We're doing adaptive target selection in real time, as opposed to doing it in a pre-planned basis. In a pre-planned basis, I have time. I can put it into a database. And so if it's doing it in real time, there's a real war going on, I have less confidence in that. Another thing, is there a ground truth against which you could evaluate the application's output? By this, I mean, it's not only can you get a ground truth, but is there one even in principle? So if you talk about optimizing courses of action and coming up with the best possible alternative, those are very complex judgment calls. There's no way of knowing whether or not it suggests course A versus course B, and course A is better. How do you know what's right? How do you know that's better? Whereas if you say it's optimal with respect to fuel consumption, you can calculate that it's pretty close to optimal fuel consumption. You check that out. The next one on the list is, if you can separate AI functionality from the rest of the system. Now, this is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? Because the AI functionality might go crazy. It might not work. And in that case, you want to be able to turn it off. Maybe you'll get degraded function in your system. That's okay. It's better than having no function at all. But you don't want to be in a situation where you have the system, the AI is malfunctioning, you wish you could turn it off and you can't. That's a really bad situation to be in. So you want to be able to turn it off. And turns out that turning something off often has cascading consequences. So you have to build that functionality, the turn off function, carefully. And you have to be willing to do that. The last thing is that I want there to be an independent safety mechanism that can recognize really bad consequences, really bad outcomes, and then prevent them. In a factory, you may have seen these big robot arms that go around, these big heavy things that swing around and so on. There's a safety mechanism there. What they do is they weld big, heavy metal blocks to the floor that prevent the arm from swinging out beyond those arcs. So the AI controlling the arm can go crazy. It can go swing the arm back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, but it won't go outside the arc. Why not? Not because it was programmed not to go out, but because those blocks keep it from swinging outside. It's an independent safety mechanism that's available in case the worst thing happens to the arm. The people who are programming the arm have nothing to do with the welding of the blocks. Let's translate this into a military case. It is well known that our test ICBMs that we launch from Vandenberg Air Force Base have self-destruct mechanisms in them. But the operational missiles don't have those self-destruct mechanisms in them. We don't want them there. That's right. Why don't we want them? Because we're afraid that if we try to launch them, the Russians might compromise them and destroy our ICBMs in flight and so on. Okay, we understand that. Now, let's say you had a system that decided to do a launch on warning. You would absolutely insist on having self-destruct mechanisms. Why? Because in case the system ordered a launch mistakenly, you would destroy them in flight. I'm not advocating to launch on warning, but if you went down that path, you would absolutely have to have the destruct in flight capability. You'd absolutely have to have it because this thing would be catastrophically out of control. And you wouldn't want that to be controlled by the AI that launched the system. You want it to be controlled by somebody else. At Vandenberg, there's a range safety officer whose only job is to make sure that the missile is on course. It's not going to go crazy. I have those criteria, and in some loose sense of the term, I say the more you can say yes to all of those conditions, the less risky it is. We can get into an argument about whether any given application has 5 yeses or 4 yeses, but at least we'll have the argument. And I think that going down this kind of path is a better way of doing it than going through any kind of a formal risk analysis.
As a reader, this is one of the things that I found the most helpful in structuring my own thinking about managing these risks and weighing them and thinking about how they fit into the larger nuclear enterprise is, this set of criteria that you've just walked us through for addressing whether AI applications are low risk or high risk and how those risks might be mitigated.
I want to say one other thing about a list of 5 or 6. It's a work in progress. If somebody listening to this podcast wants to add another one, send me a note and we'll do something together. I'll give you credit on the next one. There could be more additional criteria and it's not final by any means. Sheena, please continue. Sorry.
No, I think that's a great point. This is very much as technology emerges, our thinking emerges, we add, we build frameworks, we adapt them to what we know about reality. And this actually raises a question that I wanted to get into that appears, I think, a little bit earlier in the article, which is the idea that you propose of this garbage in, garbage out problem with the use of AI. And so I actually wanted to sort of back up and say, can you explain that problem to the reader and where it enters into these conversations and some of these examples you've been giving us?
These are the realities about machine learning that I remind the readers of, that for people who don't quite understand what computers are. On the garbage in, garbage out, it will not surprise anybody to know that if you put bad data into a computer program, you're going to get bad results out of it. And AI is just another computer program. It's not magic. It's another computer program. And if you give it bad data, it will give you bad results. And the problem, of course, is when you give it bad data and you don't know it's bad data. And now you think it's good data, and now you think it's giving you good results when it's really giving you bad results. That's the real problem. But people have known this for years, and there's no way you can get around that problem. Some other things that it's really important to remember about AI. By AI, I usually mean machine learning for a particular reason, which I'll get to in a minute. AI is just another way of programming a computer. That means all of the things that we know about computers are true about AI programming for computers. So don't expect it to do things that really computers can't do. These are computers that are more or less the same as the computers that have been around since World War II. The second point that I raise here is that the internal operations of machine learning systems are basically incomprehensible to human beings. At least in conventional programming, you have explicit coding of instructions and you can follow the path in principle. But if you look at the inside of a machine learning system, all you see is numbers that are changing, and you have no idea how they correspond to any behavioral change. So that's a problem. And the next point I think is actually pretty significant, which is that machine learning is basically statistics. It's meaningful to think about a chatbot like ChatGPT as a conversational interface to some very powerful statistical capabilities that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. Basically, what's underlying machine learning is statistics. And you remember what you were taught in Statistics 101. Correlation is not causation. That lesson is really important, which means that if you think about it, something that's purely machine learning will never give you a causal explanation for something. It may give you a statistical explanation, but it won't ever give you a causal explanation. And since we talk about explanations as being mostly causal, it's not going to give you that. And so you're going to have to try something else. People in the field understand this, but I think it's not a widely understood problem, and it remains an unsolved issue among machine learning experts. The final point that I want to make here is that machine learning, AI, doesn't change the nature of reality. It doesn't change the laws of physics. You may remember that the time that you get from Russian launch of an ICBM to impact is about 25 or 30 minutes or so. So when people say, if we use AI, we'll get more decision time for the president. Now the president only gets 15 minutes at most. We'll give him more time. Well, you're only going to get 30 minutes at most. So then the question is, would the debate be significantly different if the president were getting 30 minutes to make a decision? I'm not sure it would be. So, there's limits to having additional warning time. Yes, but the maximum warning time is constrained to the laws of physics, and AI can't change that. That's an important point to make here. A related point, which I don't remember if I made in the article, if you remember the false alarm that happened in 1979 when there was a test tape that was inserted into NORAD computers and it signaled that there was an attack on the United States, and it turned out to be a test tape. I remember that one. AI would never be able to tell you that that was a fake attack. Why? Because all the data inputs were designed to be real. And if the AI were just processing all of those inputs, which it would be, it would also say it was a real attack. But you'd have to go outside to know that it was a fake, that it was a mistake. You'd have to go outside the system, outside the test environment, in which case you're no longer doing the test of the system. Those are, I think, some of the fundamentals of AI and machine learning that you have to understand the significance of what AI does.
That's really interesting, Herb. As you talk about this, I'm really struck by these differences between the way that AI uses statistical analysis versus causation, and how difficult it is for humans to really QA and understand what it's doing. I'm kind of curious, in the article you talked about that the current national commitments to keep humans in control don't go far enough. I'm wondering, what does that mean for human control to be meaningful? And what do current policies get wrong about this?
I wish I had a better answer than the one I'm about to give you. Okay, I don't. Meaningful and appropriate is context dependent. I point out that the words in the DoD directive on lethal autonomous weapons, 3000.09, I think is the number. It uses the term appropriate levels of human judgment or something like that. I assume that it means that if you have the ability to kill lots of people, it takes a higher rank to be able to order it. Whereas if, smaller number of casualties anticipated, you can devolve that further down the chain of command. I mean, that's the sort of thing that I would expect. But I don't know, and it hasn't been formalized. And it's very much on a case-by-case basis. That's the part you won't like. I wish I could give you a better answer. There's a lot of literature on what meaningful human control means. This phrase is not original to me. My recollection is that Heather Roth wrote about this about 10 years ago. I commend her work as a place to start on it. But the debate is obviously not settled. I don't have any particular wisdom on what appropriate or meaningful should be, but I know that it's an important debate to have.
How about I turn it around a little bit and ask you what it should not be? What are we doing wrong right now? Or better, maybe, what do current policies not fully encompass? What are they not doing right?
There's a phrase that technologists often use about how policymakers think about this stuff, is that they think they can sprinkle technology dust over something, pixie dust, and then magical things happen. I've certainly seen that in cyber. I see it in AI. I think people are looking at this thing as a magic solution to very hard problems. They say, we'll just give it to AI and AI will figure out what the right thing to do is. And it won't. And just because ChatGPT will output an essay that is grammatically correct doesn't mean that it will actually give you something that's sensible. Out of linguistics, there's a famous sentence that Noam Chomsky invented that's formally correct, but meaningless. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That is grammatically correct, and yet is a meaningless statement. There's another wonderful phrase that actually has good semantic meaning, but is incomprehensible grammatically, although it is still grammatical. It's buffalo, 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 period. And it turns out that if you look up that phrase on the internet, you'll find an extensive linguistic analysis of how, in fact, it's a correct statement and has semantic meaning. Sort of stupid, but this question of meaning is endlessly debated.
So let me take us in a slightly different direction and go back to something you touched on earlier, but that I really wanted to follow up with you on. And that's that you seem deeply skeptical in this article about the possibility of a verifiable agreement to limit AI in nuclear systems. And you mentioned earlier that that's related to the idea that AI is essentially software. And so I wondered, could you talk to us about, is that a technological problem? Is it a political problem? What does that mean for efforts to build norms around AI and nuclear risk? And do you see then any realistic, productive path forward to make progress on this issue?
The last question I can easily answer. No. Here's one. Sheena, what kind of cell phone do you have?
I have an iPhone.
An iPhone, what model?
I don't know. A couple back.
Okay, let's say it's a 13, okay? And it's probably on revision 14 or something like that of its software, let's say. And let's say Ryan has the same phone. How do you know that the software, that your operating system is exactly the same as his? The answer is you don't know. You're just trusting the manufacturer. So to get into the code takes on-site inspection of a very intrusive sort. I have to actually go to the computer, go to the phone, put instruments on it, and look at the code that it's running. Then I inspect it. I say, oh yes, it's got all the right, markers of it and so on. First of all, it's impossible to do that because there's huge amounts of code in there. But never mind that. You go and say, oh, this is all good. And now you leave, and I just take the code out and I put another version of code in, which is the one that I really wanted to use. The problem is that the circumvention issues are so easy to do that you can't ever verify anything like this. And then you have to say, well, is there any use to an unverifiable agreement? Well, yeah, I think there is. But once you talk about unverifiable agreements, you're not talking treaty anymore. You're talking about political commitments. That's okay. I don't object to political commitments as a way of making progress, but that's the best you're going to be able to do. That's the problem. That code is something that changes dynamically. You can't freeze it.
Let me turn to the question of international diplomacy. If these are essentially political commitments, and that's what we're left with as thinking about a potential path forward or potential framework, are there conversations happening now that you think are the most promising, or are there ones happening that you think are really concerning?
Well, okay, so you've already heard my skepticism about keeping people in the loop. And you may remember that the last administration invested a certain amount of political capital in getting a whole bunch of people to agree to the Declaration on the Responsible Use of Military AI, which emphasized things like people in the loop and so on. I hope that the present administration will continue that effort. I don't know that it will, but I have no indications yet that it won't. So I hope that this thing will happen. And this is a good thing because it gets people talking about it. Am I skeptical about it's going far enough? Yes. So we've already discussed that. I think that we should be doing something else. But is it better than nothing? Absolutely. It's better than nothing. And, that's sort of the path of arms control and international agreements. As often, it's better than nothing.
So you close the article in the Texas National Security Review. We're really grateful to have had the chance to publish the article. But you close with a call for policymakers to develop better understandings of AI's risks and applications. So what does that look like in practice? How do we do that? And who especially needs to do that right now?
That's actually a hard question to answer. In some sense, it's the thing that I've devoted a huge amount of my professional life towards. That is policymakers who don't understand technology and the limitations, what it can do, what it can't do. Often there are technological solutions to things. Often there are not. And policymakers often look to technology to solve things when they can and don't look to technology to solve things when they can. And I have seen operationally many decisions that have been taken over the years in a variety of different contexts where people, I think, made a poor decision or a less good decision because they didn't understand what technology did and didn't do. Every one of those things is a missed opportunity. And life is hard enough without missing opportunities.
Well, thank you. I think that's a really important note to end on. Thanks for joining us on Horns of a Dilemma from the Texas National Security Review. Our guest today has been Herb Lin from Stanford, author of the article Artificial Intelligence and Nuclear Weapons, A Commonsense Approach to Understanding Costs and Benefits, which, as always, can be accessed for free on our website, tnsr.org. Herb, thank you very much for joining us today and for a really interesting conversation.
Delighted to have been here. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen. We love hearing from you. You can find more of our work at tnsr.org. Today's episode was produced by TNSR Digital and Technical Manager Jordan Morning and made possible by the University of Texas System. This is Sheena Chestnut Greitens and Ryan Best. Thanks so much for listening.